Who these troops were, why they fought, and the institutional realities they faced. The sheer numbers and geographical origins of the troops are staggering, revealing the truly global nature of the conflict. The British Empire, facing the demands of total war, relied heavily on its dominions and colonies. The Indian Army alone became the largest volunteer army in history, swelling to over 2.5 million men. Beyond India, soldiers came from every corner: the King's African Rifles in East Africa, regiments from West Africa, and sailors and airmen from the Caribbean. Across the Channel, the French Empire mobilized its vast colonial forces. The Tirailleurs, Senegalese, Moroccan, Algerian, and Tunisian soldiers formed a crucial and often primary component of the initial French defense against the German Blitzkrieg in 1940. The paradox of their recruitment is crucial to understanding their sacrifice. For many, enlisting was a practical necessity, a reliable source of income for families struggling under colonial economic policies. For others, it was adherence to tradition or a genuine belief in fighting fascism, often intertwined with a hope that loyalty would earn political rights after the war. But their service was immediately defined by systemic discrimination, a fundamental division based on race. This was the reality of the two standards. Colonial troops received vastly different pay, rations, and equipment compared to their white counterparts. A crucial example is the pay discrepancy. For the same duty, a British private was paid significantly more than an Indian or African soldier. This institutionalized inequality was not just a matter of economics, it reflected a deliberate racial hierarchy in combat. This hierarchy dictated their strategic use. Colonial troops were frequently placed on the front lines of the most immediate and brutal fighting, such as the initial chaotic defense of France in 1940, or used for prolonged, grinding campaigns in unforgiving territories where attrition was high. They were expected to absorb the initial shock, often paying the highest price for empires that viewed them as indispensable shields, yet inherently unequal citizens. This setup ensured that the immense human cost of World War II would be distributed along racial lines, making the stories of these millions of men tragically overlooked in traditional narratives of Allied victory. In North Africa and the Desert War, Indian and East African divisions were critical to the campaigns against the Africa Corps. Their tenacity and skill in harsh, arid environments were vital. The 4th Indian Division, for instance, displayed extraordinary heroism in capturing Keren in East Africa, a victory essential for securing the Suez Canal route, and they played a decisive role in halting Rommel at El Alamein. Simultaneously, the Free French forces, heavily reliant on African and Arab colonial troops, sustained the Allied effort from the earliest days of the war. The immense human cost is perhaps most evident in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, a theater often dubbed the Forgotten War. Here, the core service of the Indian Army in the Burma campaign was foundational to defeating the Japanese. Fighting in the most unforgiving jungle terrain, enduring brutal disease, and fighting against a determined and ruthless enemy, their sustained combat was essential to breaking the Japanese push toward India. The legendary Gurkhas, known for their fierce bravery, were integral to countless battles, demonstrating tenacity that broke Japanese lines time and again. However, their contribution was not limited to colonial or distant theaters. In Europe, Moroccan and Algerian Gumirs fought with legendary ferocity in the brutal, high-altitude mountain warfare in Italy. Their exceptional skills in rugged terrain were pivotal in breaking the stalemate, particularly in the difficult advance toward Rome and the bloody battles around Monte Cassino. Furthermore, West African and Caribbean troops were omnipresent in supporting roles, providing essential services in logistics, construction, and engineering during the liberation of France and the push into Germany, ensuring the supply lines of the Allied armies never faltered. The most immediate and brutal reality was the disproportionate casualty rate. Statistical analysis demonstrates that colonial units often suffered significantly higher casualty rates than their European counterparts. This was largely due to their frequent and calculated deployment in shock or holding roles, assignments meant to absorb the heaviest initial Axis fire or hold precarious defensive lines during prolonged attrition warfare. They were deliberately used as the expendable shield. Furthermore, these troops were targets of specific racialized atrocities. The brutality they faced was compounded by Axis policies that viewed them as racially inferior. During the fall of France in 1940, German forces engaged in the systematic massacre of captured Senegalese tirailleurs. These actions were not isolated incidents of combat fury. They were based on explicit directives rooted in Nazi racial ideology, designed to terrorize and eliminate non-white soldiers. Similarly, in the Pacific, Indian, African, and Pacific Islander prisoners of war, POWs, in Japanese camps, endured treatment that was often more savage and resulted in higher death rates than that inflicted upon their white Allied comrades. Following the war, the neglect was immediate and institutional. The fallen faced the harsh reality of the forgotten war dead. There was often a lack of recognition in official histories and, tragically, institutionalized segregation of war cemeteries and memorials immediately following the conflict, separating the remains and the memory of these soldiers from their white counterparts. For those who survived and returned home, the final insult was the withholding of rights and benefits. Despite their immense sacrifices, the British and French governments enacted deliberate policies to maintain the colonial status quo, keeping these decorated veterans at a lower social and economic status. A shocking and emblematic example is the French policy of freezing the pensions of African veterans, calculating them based on the currency value at the time of their nation's independence, while allowing the pensions of French metropolitan veterans to rise with inflation. This act of financial discrimination impoverished the very men who had bled for the Republic's freedom. This systematic neglect and institutional betrayal meant that the colonial soldier did not merely risk his life in combat. He risked his dignity, his memory, and his economic future for an empire that ultimately refused to pay its moral or financial debt. Their sacrifice was immense, but the resulting social contract was immediately broken. The conclusion of this story is not found in the signing of surrender documents, but in the profound geopolitical shifts that followed the silence of the guns. The Allied victory was materially impossible without the millions of colonial troops who paid the highest price, and yet their return home sparked a transformation that the empires never anticipated. For the soldiers returning to India, Africa, and the Caribbean, the war had functioned as a massive, unintended education in the fallibility of their colonizers. They had lived, fought, and died alongside white soldiers, often outperforming them in the most brutal conditions imaginable. The myth of European racial superiority, the psychological foundation upon which colonial rule was built, had been shattered on the battlefields of El Alamein, Monte Cassino, and the jungles of Burma. They had seen the masters of the world vulnerable, terrified, and defeated. The aura of invincibility was gone forever. This realization became the spark of independence. These veterans returned home not just with medals, but with organizational skills, leadership experience, and a heightened political consciousness. They had fought for the freedom of Europe while being denied it in their own lands, a hypocrisy that became the primary engine for anti-colonial movements. In India, the massive homecoming of over 2 million battle-hardened veterans made the continuation of British rule physically and politically untenable. In French West Africa and the Maghreb, the outrage over frozen pensions and the lack of basic civil rights for war heroes directly fueled the protests and insurgencies that would eventually lead to the dismantling of the French Empire. The very men who were recruited to save the empires became the primary architects of their dissolution. However, the road to recognition has been a long and agonizingly slow one. For decades, the official histories of World War II were whitewashed, focusing almost exclusively on European and American narratives, while relegating the colonial contribution to the footnotes. It has taken over half a century for the global community to begin reconciling this moral debt. We see this today in the late-stage apologies from European governments, the retrospective awarding of honors, and the recent efforts to desegregate the memory of the war dead in military cemeteries. But recognition is more than just plaques and monuments. It is the fundamental acknowledgement that the modern world's freedom was bought with the blood of men who were never intended to share in its rewards. The sacrifice of these soldiers remains one of the most significant and unresolved moral deaths of the 20th century. Their story is a reminder that the greatest generation was a global generation, composed of men from every continent who fought for a future they were not permitted to see. As we unearth these brutal realities, we must realize that the Allied victory was not just a military triumph, but a global human effort that ultimately cost the old empires their reach. The overlooked service of the colonial soldier is not just a part of history, it is the hidden foundation upon which the modern world was built. Their legacy is the map of the modern world itself, a map drawn by the hands of those who were once considered expendable, but who proved to be indispensable.